and welcome everyone to a special, not usual episode of Control Alt Access. You can tell it's a special episode by the fact that I am not joined by my usual co-host. If this is your first episode watching, my name is Laura. I'm an accessibility critic and consultant, and I am joined today by Grant Stoner. Hey, Grant.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I wanted to get you on to do something because I saw you bemoaning the fact that not enough people were letting you talk about Elden Ring, and I have an excuse to let you talk about Elden Ring.
No, I appreciate it. I give any reason to talk about that game. It's one of
uh,
my favorite games.
so for anyone who doesn't know you and the stuff you do already, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am an accessibility and disability reporter in the games industry. A lot of my work covers developer innovations, what the community uh appreciates, what they need, what's lacking from accessibility for disabled people. Um, and I've been doing this for roughly 5 years. Um, a lot of my work removes the first person context because growing up, I found that most stories about disabled people only include the same small handful of people, and that's no disrespect to them. But I always figured that you can't necessarily report on accessibility and only highlight 5 or 10 people. You need to broaden that audience to get as many perspectives as possible. Um, so I've been doing that for roughly 5 years. I was an editor at Can I Play That for a year and a half, and now I freelance across the industry at places like IGN, Inverse, VGBs, which is a new publication, um, different sites
Yeah,
around the internet.
I I highly recommend if any of you are the kind of person who's watching a podcast about accessibility and you're not already following Grant's work, absolutely everything that Grant puts out is superb quality, fantastic work. So, if I imagine most of you watching this will already be aware of Grant, but if you're not, go deal with that now. So before we dig into Elden Ring, this is a weird week to be talking about accessibility stuff because there is the elephant in the room of there have been some pretty big losses in the accessibility community in the couple of days prior to recording this. We first learned of the passing of Brandon Cole on this past weekend. We've talked about Brandon Cole before. Brandon has been an absolutely instrumental part of working on blind player accessibility, particularly in the AAA space. He did fantastic work on games like The Last of Us Part 2, Part 1 Remake, recently Forza Motorsport. Not only incredibly influential in terms of the kind of work he was doing, but also just a wonderful, delightful person to get to chat with, and his loss is definitely notable. And then barely had we had time to process that that was occurring, then we got the news that Milan Patel, who is someone I've recently been working with on accessibility consulting stuff with Easy Surf, has also passed away. It is one of those things I think where both of these would have been a real blow to have happened, but anytime a couple of deaths like this happen within a community, it kind of hits a little different, and it is a real shame to have lost such bright, wonderful people doing such good work so close together.
Yeah, it's the accessibility community is already so close knit.
Mm.
We're all intimately aware of each other. We're all very familiar with each other's work and personalities. We've all either seen each other at conventions or events, or had the privilege of working with them, like you, or interviewing them, like me. And I know you've written stories before where you've spoken with some consultants. It's very the work that they do and unfortunately did, uh, there's going to be a gap now because of their loss, and it would be noticeable. Not only for accessibility, but just their brightness in the community in general. There were always fixtures with discussions and support. I know, especially with Disability Pride Month being this month,
Yeah.
they were both very vocal and proud of the work they did and proud of the communities they represented. So it's going to be a very rough month, I think, for the community at large.
I think so indeed, and there's not a lot that we can do in this moment, but I think like my couple of things I would take away is it's really important that people keep pushing for the kinds of accessibility advancements that both Brandon and Milan were pushing for. But also, hey, if there's someone doing good work in this space who you value what they've done and it's helped you to be able to keep playing games, let them know while they are around to know, because I think that's the best thing you can do is to just make sure that people know the work they're doing is valued while they can. Um, so yeah, no easy segue out of this, but we're here today to talk about Elden Ring, and primarily to talk about the fact that if we just gave Elden Ring an easy mode, it would be completely accessible, and that's accessibility fixed and sorted, right, Grant?
No, that's
Oh,
not true. Yeah,
I'm so
shocking.
shocked and horrid.
It- it's a conversation I've seen continuously creep up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with like Bloodborne when that released, with Sekiro when that released,
Yeah.
and any time a FromSoft game releases or a studio debuts a new title that's FromSoft adjacent,
Yeah.
similar to like Souls like the genre, the conversation from both um, disabled people and able-bodied people is that easy mode is both the hero and antithesis
Mm.
of everything for these games, and it's just it waters down the legitimate critiques of these games. It erases the good work that they do in terms of their design practices, and it also erases the very real accessibility barriers that these games continue to have.
Yeah, it really strips these games down. It's far from me to suggest the internet reduces nuance in conversations. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things where I think a part of the frustration is that easy mode seems like such an easy place to start with those kind of conversations that if you can't even have maybe if this were a little less difficult, if you can't get over that hurdle, it feels almost futile to some people, I think, to try and dig into the more granular nuances. But like we're having this conversation now because Shadow of the Erd Tree, the big Elden Ring DLC, came out recently and reignited this conversation. And I've been playing through Shadow of the Erd Tree, and at no point is like difficulty the first thing that has come up for me in terms of like what would make this game more accessible. Like first thing on my list, top of my list, is they've designed this DLC with a more vertical layout. And a big problem that introduces is navigating its map. There are several large portions of this DLC map that are absolutely inscrutable to work out how to get to, and that require incredibly lengthy, weird detours from completely unintuitive parts of the map, and that this game just has no tools designed to help if you are just completely stuck, unsure how to navigate to find your bearings. That's nothing to do with difficulty, but that's the first thing that I think of when I think of things that have caused me real problems in this.
Yeah, for me, especially, the lack of new spells that cause staggering effects.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a few that I found. I think roughly I found three or four because I play a magic user. I'm basically using the same kit that they used to beat the main game.
Mm.
But unfortunately, because there's new enemy types and the increase in difficulty, which is ironic, saying we shouldn't put this away, but the increase in difficulty, the same spells just aren't doing it anymore.
Mm.
And so, with the lack of like stronger spells that have different effects, like frostbite build-up, staggering, um, there's a few gravity spells that still don't really cut it. It
Mm.
it it makes it feel like magic users got the short end of the stick.
Yeah, there's a few build types that feel like they've really gotten the short end of the stick. I would say a lot of the enemy types and boss types in this DLC compared to the base game skew towards very, very quick attack patterns with very little window to attack back. And that very much disincentivizes using like heavier weapons or anything that requires a bit of a wind up. Is far more disincentivized. You are really pushed to use stuff that doesn't commit you to any kind of long combo, that you can reliably do a single hit and then back out. And again, this is not an inherently bad design choice, but it is a design choice that can punish you if you're someone who, for example, prefers heavier weapons because it requires less mashing of the attack button because there is longer between input moments. That becomes a playstyle that just by nature of how the bosses are designed is less accessible.
It also it's weird because it's everything you just said, but also on the flip side, for magic users and other casters like Faith,
Mm.
this DLC is more suited to their playstyle,
Mm.
especially if you use mimics or
Yes.
summons or co-op, because the bosses are incredibly aggressive.
Mm.
The only issue is there's the spells that are offered just don't do enough damage.
Mm.
So even though you're not as drawn to fights, if you're a ranged player,
Mm.
you still can't do enough proper damage to feel like you're contributing to the fight.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about there's the way that damage scaling has been handled in the DLC because for anyone who's not played Shadow of the Erd Tree, your leveling that you've done in the base game is honestly kind of insignificant in terms of the damage you will deal in the DLC. It'll still be important for can I wield this weapon? Do I have the prerequisite stats? And it'll impact things like scaling. But fundamentally, there is a new pickup system, these tree fragments, that have a much bigger impact on your sturdiness and your damage output. And I kind of don't mind it in some ways because a lot of these fragments can be achieved without doing combat. And there is something I like about if you are struggling with damage output, at least in theory, I like the idea of I could look up a map of where these fragments are and run to them and grab them and just be fundamentally a bit more powerful than I was before without the combat loop being needed for that. But that feels like it needs to come with it's coming it's not being paired along with the rest of the tools that are needed to keep pace with the increased damage of the DLC, I think.
I think the DLC's biggest uh like win, but also failure is its use of exploration.
Mm.
Because in the base game, you were encouraged to uh, find every corner of
Mm.
the map. You were encouraged to discover new tombs,
Mm.
fight optional bosses. You were encouraged to explore the world.
Mm.
And in the DLC, that's very much the same, but it's not a necessity.
Mm.
So if you don't explore, like you said, you can't find the tree fragments or the revered spirit
Yeah.
ashes, which can buff your summons. But if you do explore, there's no directional indicators of am I in a good area? Am I in an area where I'm not supposed to be at this time? So you may just wander into a place where you get stuck by
Mm.
enemies that you can't progress through because maybe your tree level isn't high enough yet. It's
Yeah.
it's it's something I would have appreciated far more in the base game
Mm.
because I do agree with you that this unique way of leveling is far more beneficial
Mm.
than the standard like level up your soul level or your rune level. Because it's a much more noticeable and substantial jump
Mm.
in your damage and defenses. But the issue is, again, it's you have to explore,
Yes.
but you don't know where you're going.
Yeah. And part of me wishes that there was a bit better signaling from a distance of, there's I forget what they're called, the sort of glowing crosses
Yeah,
that
the
usually,
Mikola,
yeah, that usually
yeah,
signal that there'll be a fragment near them. I wish those were visible from a further distance, so I could sort of look over from a big vista and go, that's a waypoint. Sort of like something like Breath of the Wild, where you could zoom in and pinpoint that shrine that you can see from a distance and go grab it.
mhm.
But also, I think there are times where this DLC feels like it almost deliberately misleads and doesn't give the kind of hand-holding of direction, or of at least intended recommended path that the base game did. And I think a really good example of this is one of the first paths you can end up taking is towards this area that has the I forget what it's called, but it's the boss that is a lion costume, a two-halved lion
The
costume.
Divine Lion Beast.
Yes, the Divine Lion
Yes,
Beast. And if you end up going and fighting the Divine Lion Beast, which is pretty near the start, it's pretty easy for that to end up being your first boss. What the game will do is it will point you to the next location that you technically would need to go to after this, which is the very end of the game, which is blocked off by branches and you cannot progress through. And because you've found that the game, like in the base game, you've got this system where it's like pointing to you to this is probably the next bonfire equivalent you want to head to, and it'll guide you through the game. I spent 2/3 of the DLC with just this one point telling me to go to a dead end and nothing else signposting me through the world. And it wasn't until much, much, much later that I found some bonfire that apparently got it back on track and was like, "Oh yeah, no, 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 we'll lead you somewhere actually helpful."
I also think the Divine Lion was a good like from soft tease
Mm,
because it really forced you to accept the fact that you need these tree fragments and the spirit
yeah.
ashes. But you can get to it, like you said, fairly early.
Mm,
I think it took me roughly 30 to 45 minutes to get to that boss
yeah.
when first starting. But if you don't have any of the fragments, you just get obliterated immediately.
Yes. And I think that the game is at least fair in that regard. Like it makes it very
Yes,
clear, and I think this is something that the Souls games have always been like decent at, but particularly I think Elden Ring's base game did really very well. Is it will make it clear if something you can technically reach is something you really shouldn't be trying to fight yet.
yeah,
And I think like an interesting example of that is the furnace golems in the DLC, because the first time you run across them, maybe 10 minutes into the game, if you start swinging at its legs, you will do basically no damage, and there is a bit of a trick to it. Maybe you can damage it a bit more quickly than it seems, but it's doing the job of signaling maybe come back to this later in a way that like I do think these games do a good job of, and I think has only benefited from the move to open world design in terms of giving you that flexibility to go, I know that genuinely there's a lot of choices of other places I can go rather than force myself to do this.
I would say Elden Ring's and even From Software's biggest accessibility achievement within the past 10 years was opening up the map to
Yeah.
open world. Um, because if you don't know, previously all games were very linear, and you
Mm.
had to beat all specific sections before you could progress. Um, Whereas in Elden Ring, the base game, even the DLC, even though it's on a much smaller scale, if a boss is causing issues, you can just leave.
Yeah.
And I know. many of the bosses are purely optional. Like the Divine Lion.
Yeah.
You don't even need to beat him for the game.
I did not know that until today, but apparently that is correct. Yeah, it's one of those things that makes the conversation around like easy mode in Souls games complicated because I think in many ways I would say Elden Ring is more accessible in terms of difficulty than prior Souls games, despite the fact that there are definitely more powerful, more damaging, more threatening things in that world to be possible roadblocks because of that fact that you aren't as forced to take a linear path. And I think that it can't be overstated how much I'm hitting a difficulty roadblock. I can leave, go fight some things that are just more suited to my playstyle and that I'll have an easier time overcoming. Gain some levels, maybe come back to this when I'm a little overpowered to help adjust for that. I think does a lot to smooth out that game's difficulty curve in ways that are easy to overlook.
It also redefines um, what accessibility is and can
Mm,
be. Because I know a lot of conversations surrounding accessibility are options, right?
yeah,
Like we just games like The Last of Us 2,
yeah,
which has over 70 options in it,
mm,
and a lot of disabled people review a game with very low options, like Elden Ring, for example,
yeah,
and be like, oh well, this game just isn't accessible for that reason. But it really emphasizes the importance of good inclusive design
yeah,
because Elden Ring's accessibility is primarily through player choice.
mm,
Player choice of where you go, what you fight, how you level, what your builds are, who you summon. Everything that you do and decide to do is what makes the game accessible,
yeah. It
even though there are still some very obvious barriers.
Yeah, this is something I talk about a lot, and I recognize that I think as many people in accessibility conversations, like I fell into that trap a little when starting of looking at the number and going, look how many choices there are. But
Me too,
it's
yeah.
yeah, it's important to remember if you're new to this space, like there is a difference between accessibility settings and accessible design choices, and often an accessible design choice can make it so that a setting doesn't need to exist. The really easy example of this to go to is colorblind accessibility. If you can design your game to be fundamentally accessible to people of all types of colorblindness, such that you don't need to apply filters, that game doesn't have colorblindness settings, but is colorblind friendly inherently, and being one setting down doesn't mean the game is less accessible. And yeah, it's one of those things where I think a lot of the stuff around Souls games being inaccessible is built around the. I think it owes some part to the kind of toxic conversations around them because like it's impossible to talk about these games without acknowledging there is a community of people who will tell you you're playing the game wrong, who will tell you you're cheating if you do X, Y, and Z, in ways that will discourage doing things that might make difficult moments more manageable. Like the really obvious examples is like the mimic tier summon in Elden Ring, which is just a little ghost clone of yourself that can help summoning in other players to help you in fights, so that you've got someone to just draw aggression and give you a bit of breathing room. But also in terms of like, I think it is entirely valid with a game like this to be like, look, maybe this isn't my regular playstyle, but this one boss I just can't beat. I'm gonna go to the character that lets me respec my stats, put everything into health and whatever lets me carry the biggest, beefiest shield in the game. I'm gonna summon in another player to help me, and I'm gonna stand behind my big beefy shield and just drink potions and hide behind my shield and let someone help me through it. And like the game does have the tools for you to do that, which is something I think a lot of Souls imitators fail to understand. Is sometimes there will be a point that is just fundamentally a barrier for a person that they just cannot get through any other way. Give them enough tools that they can throw their build around a bit and just go, someone else help me while I cower. And that should be something you can do to keep enjoying a game.
I think the two games for me that come to mind with uh, attempting to do that, but ultimately fall short are uh, the Jedi series.
Mm-hmm.
Just Jedi, the series, you're entirely on your own with every fight.
Mm.
There were some fights in the sequel where Cal had some assistance, but primarily you're fighting each boss by yourself.
Mm.
Um, which means that you're consistently aggroed. You
Mm.
can't switch up your playstyle because the only fighting style is just with your lightsaber. You can
Yeah.
use different stances, but they don't really change fundamentally how the enemy attacks you.
Mm.
And even aggro crab, a game that just came out,
Yeah.
which does accessibility very well, but its solution for the issue of challenge and difficulty and
Mm.
player choice is just give you a gun, which ultimately removes the appeal of overcoming these obstacles. Because I think this is something that a lot of disabled people want to play these games.
Mm.
They don't want an easier experience. They
Mm.
just want an experience that their needs are met and they can still feel
Yeah.
like the feelings of accomplishment and overcoming enemies.
Yeah. It's another Grab's Treasure is an interesting one to talk about because it's got a couple of things in there that I do fundamentally really appreciate that like I would really love having access to in a
Yes.
game like Elden Ring, particularly increased dodge invincibility window and increased parry invincibility window are two features that I'm like, yeah, fundamentally, I don't want to be fighting against a different fight. I just want like a little extra forgiveness
Hmm.
for days where I am not as quick at responding as I know I should be. And just that little bit of extra grace to still engage with it as it is. It's, I'm a big believer in like just being able to tweak some of the numbers sometimes to be like, look, can I just like turn the speed down like 5%? Can I tweak those damage numbers just a little bit so that I can feel like I'm in with a chance of it? And I know
Right.
that that's not the right fit for everyone, but sometimes it's just I want to just be able to nudge it, just nudge it enough that like it doesn't fundamentally change the experience, but I feel like this hurdle is surmountable. And I think that's what things like summoning the in the mimic tier to draw aggro fundamentally are. It's trying to introduce something that gives you that little bit of extra breathing room or that little bit of extra room to make mistakes, so that you have that extra room to I think for me part of it is just more time in the fight alive means I have more time to learn, and that's going to help me get through better than just getting killed in a couple of attacks before I've had a chance to internalize. All of those kind of work toward the same goal, I think.
Yeah, especially because that was ultimately Miyazaki's design goal for every Souls game. It's something that the most toxic of fans continuously ignore, and it's something that disabled people seem to forget occasionally when reading interviews of his, is that these games aren't meant to be impossible. If anything, they're meant to be like chess games, I would always say, where you're meant to just analyze and, like you said, uh, pattern memorization. So you don't want to die in 5 hits. You want to stay alive so you can continuously see, oh, the boss is positioned this way. It's about to do this attack. Well, I'm prepared for that because I remember that. It's about um, pattern recognition and just overall memorization to
Hmm.
continue pushing through.
I I think about things that like I haven't seen done in Souls games that could be interesting accessibility things to play around with, and one that I think about a lot is and I think Cuphead did something similar to this. The ability to go into a boss fight, maybe with like drastically increased health, but if you beat it, it doesn't count. To be like, look, I just want to survive in this fight. Maybe I take a lot less damage or something, so that I can be alive long enough to get in my head what are the attacks, what are the patterns, what am I looking for, what are my cues. Um, you know, there are ways you can approach that kind of curve, and I think it's worth noting. Like I'm terribly paraphrasing here, so ignore the not accurate phrasing. But Miyazaki was did an interview pretty recently where he essentially said, I suck at playing these games too. I use every cheat in the book to get through them. Don't feel bad about using your Scarlet Rot and your Mimic Tears. That's how I have to get through them. And
Yeah,
I think it's that, like, getting rid of some of that shame around, like, hey, whatever gets you through, the boss will exploit anything they can to kill you. You just do the same for them.
yeah, it's very telling that the creator of these games is openly admitting like I'm awful. I will do whatever I can to beat these games in any way that's possible. And the thing about these conversations is all FromSoft games have these tools,
Mm,
aside from maybe Bloodborne and Sekiro, because they're more specific to melee combat only. But most Souls games have the tools that allow players to engage each encounter in a way that's best suitable. So if you have like limited reaction times and you prefer big heavy weapons with big heavy armor, you can do that. If you have fatigue like me and you prefer ranged combat with magic, you can do that. And there's no penalization for those playstyles. And I think that's something that should be continuously mentioned is that the communities, or a small subsection of the communities, will penalize you for using it.
yeah,
But the game itself actively rewards you for discovering
yeah,
a playstyle that best suits your needs.
yeah.
It doesn't punish you, it actively encourages you to find a build that best suits you.
Indeed. And again, I think this draws back to something you were saying before, which was, as long as the game continues to support play styles properly, that's great. And that's, again, where we come back to that issue with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC not giving you the options to deal the kind of damage the DLC needs with the playstyle that worked for you from the base game. It's making sure that in the rush to give you new things, it's not necessarily like taking a thing that worked for you in the base game and going, you can't do that anymore. It's just not up to scratch.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to share on this while you're on your soapbox and you've got your your moment where everyone has to listen to your opinions?
Um, Gosh, my opinions. I guess the most important thing is FromSoft games, I would say, aren't your enemy, the way that both communities have painted them for almost a decade. They are undoubtedly challenging, but they're not challenging in a way that is meant to be punishing.
Yeah.
They're challenging in a way that's meant to make you understand the core mechanics of each game.
Mm,
And while those can be barriers in and of themselves, the lack of difficulty modes, or even the inclusion of difficulty modes, aren't going to fundamentally change how the game plays.
mm,
I think instead of fixating on an easy mode, we should instead be advocating for better options or designs for blind and low vision players,
yeah.
for deaf or hard of hearing. I know in Elden specifically, there are several bosses that heavily rely on sound cues.
Mm,
The Black Knife Assassin,
yeah.
Astro the Voidborn, who will teleport around the map and shoot projectiles at you. There's no designs or settings to mitigate those barriers. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, difficulty is subjective.
Yeah.
What I find easy, you may not find easy. What you find easy, I may struggle with. And putting a singular setting arguably won't even do much to fix those issues that I may have, or you may have, or others may have. Um, if we looked at games like the Jazz series again, they have difficulty modes. But for me, the biggest issue is platforming.
Hmm.
Difficulty doesn't help with that at all.
Yeah.
Those are fundamental game issues that an option like a very easy setting does nothing
Yeah.
to mitigate those barriers. And I think the both communities need to understand that the vast majority, if not all, accessibility tools and designs don't change the game. They
Hmm.
just remove barriers. And a setting like an easy mode would do very little to remove the very present barriers that continue to be in each game.
I think that's fair. It's, you mentioned, platforming there. I acknowledged like navigation issues. Those are all things that don't change, that don't get changed by an easy mode. Um I think my main thing I would tell people is, hey, if you want to play one of these games and you are scared and intimidated by them, don't be afraid to Google early game overpowered build. Don't be afraid to Google easy early game grinding level location. Don't be afraid to Google boss easy cheat technique. Whatever thing lets you feel like you got one over on the game, grab it with both hands. I think that is fundamentally the tool set the game really gives you to change difficulty for things like combat. Is go use the wisdom of the greater collective that have brute forced their head against these games and gone, this is the thing that's gonna just make the game sort of bleed and cry for mercy, and you feel no shame in using those. Um,
I, I think also the vast majority of the FromSoft community are people that want to help. If you go on YouTube, like you said, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of videos like, oh, did you know you could do this? Or, oh, make sure you grab this spell if you're a caster. Oh, make sure you use this talisman for this. It's only a small subsection of people that tell you you're playing a game wrong, and the
yeah,
vast majority of FromSoft fans don't even acknowledge them because they also know that at the end of the day, it's how you enjoy the game.
yeah,
It's whatever you find that's more fun, that's most accessible. That's how you should be playing.
yeah. Uh, Also, last bit of advice: don't be afraid to just run past stuff. If it's not a boss and you're struggling with it, just run past it. Ignore
Just
it. You don't have
sprint.
to. No one's watching. You don't have to fight it. Just
No
sprint
one
past it.
cares.
You've got a horse. You can jump over them. Just run away. So yeah, I think that's probably a nice place for us to wrap this. Grant, we talked at the start about how everything you put out is great and fantastic, and people should be checking it out already. Where can they do that? Where can they find the things you put out on the internet?
Um, I'm most active on Twitter, never X.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's after that. So it's Twitter. At super underscore grip 1994. But primarily, if you're just looking for my work, I have a monthly column on IGN called Access Design, where it's just my thoughts about accessibility in the industry per month. I also write for VGBs. It's a brand new website by the former uh, owner of Fanbyte. I also write for Inverse, Game Informer occasionally. So basically, if there's a publication, just look for some accessibility pieces.
Wonderful. I think that's everything. There'll be links down in the description for all sorts of bits if you want more to check out afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone, for indulging us in Elden Ring chat, and goodbye.